It's kind of crazy when you think about it, right? That where you happen to be born in the world can actually determine whether you have access to good health.
Yeah, it is a pretty stark reality, isn't it? And if you start to dig a little deeper into this, you find that a lot of these global health inequalities we see today are kind of intertwined with, well, the legacy of colonialism.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today in this deep dive, exploring a really fascinating set of papers that form the basis of a course led by Dr. Luchuo E. Bain.
Right. He's a real pioneer in this field, challenging conventional thinking around global health. And our goal today really is to kind of unpack for you what this whole idea of decolonizing global health actually means, drawing directly from the arguments and insights presented in these academic papers.
Exactly. And we've got a really interesting mix of source material here. There are thought-provoking opinion pieces, some survey data that reveals some I guess you could say uncomfortable truths about power dynamics, and some really insightful conceptual analysis as well.
Yeah, for sure. And the question that's running through all of this for you today is this. What exactly does it mean to decolonize global health, according to these papers? And just as importantly, why is it so crucial if we're actually serious about achieving health equity for everyone, no matter where they live in the world?
Okay, so let's start maybe by just laying some groundwork here.
Yeah.
Understanding what we mean by this concept of coloniality within global health. One of the papers, we'll call it Decol 4 for now, actually gives us a pretty straightforward definition of colonialism itself. It's basically, when one group has the power to dominate and exploit another. And this isn't just about physical territory, right? It extends to labor, resources, and really importantly, knowledge itself.
Right. And then building on that, another paper, Decol 1, introduces this really critical idea of coloniality. And it's important to remember that it's not just about that historical period of colonialism, which, for the most part ended with independence movements. Coloniality refers to the ways in which those structures of power and even ways of thinking continue to exist, even after you've had formal decolonization.
Right. So it's not just about political independence. It's about deeper structures, right?
Exactly. And Decol 2 even references Quijano's concept of the colonial matrix of power, which I think helps us understand just how deeply embedded these colonial structures are in our understanding of the world in global systems.
So how does this actually play out then for people listening in the world of global health?
Well, Decol 1, I think, lays it out pretty clearly. It argues that there's this inherent bias in how we value health and well-being in the global north compared to the global south. And this bias influences everything. Who gets the funding for research, what research questions are considered important, even the methodologies that are seen as valid and rigorous.
So you're saying that it's not just about bad intentions or a lack of awareness.
Yeah.
There are these structural biases built into the system.
Precisely. And that's where this whole idea of epistemic violence comes in. Both Decol 1 and Decol 2 talk about this. And it basically refers to, the dominance of knowledge systems that come from the global north, often at the expense of local knowledge, traditional healing practices, and the voices of global south researchers.
Right. So it's about whose knowledge is valued, whose voices are heard.
Yeah. And it makes you think about how the very history of medicine itself is so intertwined with the history of colonialism, right?
Definitely. Decol 6 reminds us that a lot of the institutions we have today, medical schools, research centers, even aid projects, were originally established by colonial powers. And Decol 4 even gives this example of tropical medicine institutes that were basically set up to protect colonial personnel, not necessarily the health of the local people.
Right. And it wasn't just about protecting their health. It was often about, maintaining their economic and political control.
Absolutely. And then Decol 1 points out this uncomfortable truth that even within formerly colonized nations, individuals and institutions can sometimes unconsciously replicate these colonial patterns.
Yeah, it's like those patterns of thinking become so normalized that it's hard to even see them sometimes. And that leads us into this whole discussion of neo-colonialism.
Right. So even though many countries achieve political independence, the underlying power dynamics, the way resources flow, the way knowledge is produced and valued, all of that can still be shaped by these colonial legacies.
Exactly. Decol 4 introduces Krugman's concept of neocolonialism, which basically argues that even after independence, wealth and resources continue to be extracted from those countries, not through direct rule anymore, but through more subtle forms of economic and political control.
So it's like a new form of colonialism.
Yeah, in a way. And Decolonizing applies this specifically to global health research partnerships. What we often see is that institutions in high-income countries, HICs, they tend to set the research agenda, control the funding, and take the lead on publications.
And that can leave their partners in low and middle income countries, LMICs, feeling a bit sidelined, right?
Definitely. And the survey findings in Decolonizing, they're pretty telling. While most respondents agreed that colonialism has negatively impacted research partnerships, those based in HICs actually felt this more strongly in principle.
Interesting. So they recognize the problem in theory, but
But when it comes to the specifics, like having equal control over study design or feeling like an equal partner, there were some big differences in how HIC and LMIC respondents answered those questions.
what kind of differences are we talking about here?
Well, for example, half of the LMIC respondents felt they didn't have equal control over the research, and almost 60% of them felt they weren't viewed as equal partners in the collaboration.
Wow, those numbers are pretty stark.
Yeah, they really highlight the power imbalances that still exist. And the qualitative data from that survey was even more revealing. LMIC respondents talked about how financial control by funders really shaped the dynamics, how their HIC partners often came in with preconceived ideas, and how there was this clear sense that skills and expertise from the global north were valued more highly.
Right, so it's not just about feeling unheard, it's about the tangible ways in which resources and recognition are distributed unevenly.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of overhead funding, which was also brought up. LMIC institutions often receive significantly less funding for indirect costs compared to their HIC partners, which just adds to the financial disparities.
So all of this really paints a picture of partnerships that might look collaborative on paper, but in reality are still heavily influenced by these historical power imbalances.
Yeah, and these imbalances show up in all sorts of ways in global health research and practice. Authorship on academic papers, for instance, is a big one.
Right, who gets to be the first author, who gets to be the senior author. All of that has implications for careers and recognition.
Exactly. And Decol 1, Decol 3, and Decol 10 all talk about this trend of HIC researchers being prioritized for those top authorship positions, which are often linked to promotion requirements and career advancement.
And it's not just about individual ambition, right? It's also about the prestige and resources that flow to institutions in the global north when their researchers are the ones getting those top spots.
Absolutely. And Decol 10 also points out the role of language barriers and editorial bias. If the most prestigious journals are all publishing in English, that automatically puts researchers who speak other languages at a disadvantage.
Yeah, it creates a system that favors certain forms of knowledge and certain ways of communicating that knowledge.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of funding, which is so central to everything in global health research.
Right. Decol 3 and Decol 10 both highlight how funders, most of whom are based in the global north, tend to favor institutions in the north, even when the research is happening in LMICs.
Yeah, and this can lead to what those papers call parachute research or extractive partnerships.
Which essentially means researchers from HICs coming in, taking data, and leaving without really benefiting the local community or building long-term research capacity.
Right. And the Decol 3 also talks about how the dominance of global North universities in global health education creates barriers for students from LMICs. The high tuition fees can be prohibitive, and the reliance on soft money for faculty positions often means that researchers are incentivized to chase grants rather than build equitable partnerships.
It's like the system itself is set up in a way that perpetuates these power imbalances.
Absolutely. And Decol 4 even expands this out to the global level, talking about the influence that wealthy states and private foundations can have on organizations like the WHO.
Right, because their financial contributions often end up shaping the global health agenda,
Yeah.
sometimes in ways that might not fully reflect the needs of communities in the global south.
Yeah, and it's not just about traditional aid or research. Decol 4 also mentions the potential for exploitation within the health sector itself, even during crises like the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, we saw how pharmaceutical companies and others were able to profit immensely during the pandemic, sometimes at the expense of equitable access to vaccines and treatments.
Absolutely. So given all of these challenges, these papers then start to explore some potential pathways towards dismantling these colonial structures and decolonizing global health.
And this is where this idea of epistemic disobedience comes in. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Decol 1 and Decol 2 introduce this concept, which is basically about rejecting oppressive and exclusionary systems of knowledge production.
So it's not just about diversifying who's doing the research. It's about challenging the very frameworks that determine what counts as valid knowledge in the first place.
Right. Decole, too, talks about delinking from those dominant Western intellectual traditions. And Decole 1 gives some examples of what this might look like in practice. Things like Global South researchers insisting on senior authorship, citing scholars from marginalized communities, demanding multilingual abstracts, and challenging the idea that only one form of English is acceptable in academic publishing.
I was really struck by that phrase, dereliction of methods, in Decole 1. It's this idea of embracing diverse forms of research output beyond just the traditional academic paper.
Yeah, like using theater, poetry, video to communicate research findings in ways that are more accessible and engaging.
Exactly. And Decole 1 also emphasizes the importance of reflexivity and positionality statements, where researchers acknowledge their own backgrounds and how that might influence their research.
Right, being transparent about your own positionality is so crucial, especially when you're working across different cultures and power dynamics.
Absolutely. And then there's the need for more Global South scholars in those gatekeeping roles as editors and editorial board members.
Because those are the positions where decisions are made about what gets published, what gets funded, what gets recognized as important.
Right, it's about shifting the power dynamics within the system itself.
Yeah. And Decole 10 also includes some really practical recommendations from LMIC respondents about how to make research partnerships more equitable.
What kind of things are they talking about?
Things like building trust and respect from the beginning, having transparent decision-making processes, ensuring equitable financial control, investing in local capacity building, and providing equal opportunities for authorship.
So it's about making sure that everyone involved in the research feels like they're a genuine partner, not just a beneficiary.
Exactly. And they also had recommendations for funders, things like including LMIC partners in agenda setting, creating more equitable funding opportunities, and even funding LMIC institutions directly rather than always channeling funds through intermediaries in the North.
It's about shifting the power dynamics within the funding landscape as well.
Exactly. And Decole 3 actually gives some really encouraging examples of allyship from the global North and leadership from the global South across different levels.
What kind of examples?
Things like providing direct funding to global South institutions, changing promotion criteria to value equitable partnerships, diversifying editorial boards, and even choosing conference locations that are more accessible for researchers from the global South.
So there are concrete steps that institutions can take to address these imbalances.
Yeah, absolutely. But Decole 3 also raises this important point about the risk of elite capture within global South countries themselves.
Right, so it's not just about shifting power from north to south. It's about making sure that those shifts benefit marginalized communities within the South as well.
Exactly. And ultimately, as Decole 1 and Decole 2 both emphasize, decolonization is about a much more fundamental shift in power, in perspective, in the way we think about knowledge itself.
It's not just about tweaking the system, it's about transforming it.
Right. And finally, these papers also highlight the link between these more equitable relationships and genuine innovation in global health. Decolonizing, for example, argues that engineers and others involved in developing new technologies need to be just as focused on building equitable relationships as they are on the technology itself.
So it's not just about creating a new tool, it's about making sure that tool is actually useful and relevant to the people who are going to be using it.
Exactly, because if you're designing something in a lab in the global North without understanding the local context, the infrastructure, the cultural nuances, that technology might never be effectively deployed or gain the trust of the community.
So this whole approach to decolonizing global health is really about ensuring that knowledge is produced in a way that benefits everyone, and that solutions are tailored to the specific needs of different communities.
Absolutely. And to bring it all together for you today, this deep dive into these papers shows us that decolonizing global health is about recognizing and dismantling those historical and ongoing colonial power structures that continue to shape the field. It's about shifting from a system that centers the global North to a more inclusive, just, and equitable global health landscape for everyone.
So as you've been listening to us today, we encourage you to really think about the power dynamics at play in your own work, in your own field, wherever you are in the world. What assumptions might be shaping your own perspective?
And here's a final thought to leave you with. If we truly prioritized equity and epistemic justice in global health, what radical shifts would we need to see in terms of resources, leadership, and knowledge production? What might we gain and what might we even lose in that transformation?
It's a question worth pondering as we all work towards a more just and equitable future for global health.